Did you know that at one point Pokemon Red and Green were only going to include 30 Pokemon? Or that one of the designers of Pikachu liked him so much that he intentionally made him difficult to find because he didn't want anybody else to find one? Or that in the middle of development, all of the programmers quit at the same time and they almost lost all of their data because nobody else knew how to work with their code? Today, Pokemon is the biggest media franchise in the world and has taken over the worlds of video games, trading card games, anime, Hollywood movies, and so much more. The thing is, Pokemon as we know it today almost never existed. The 6-year development process of Pokemon Red and Green was full of financial difficulties, bad programming, and baffling game design decisions. And if it wasn't for a series of insane coincidences, a lot of luck, and a few strokes of genius, well, we wouldn't be talking about it today. In this video, I want to talk about the development of Pokemon Red and Green. How they defied the odds, narrowly avoided disaster time and time again, and became the foundation for this worldwide sensation that we call Pokemon. It may be hard to imagine, but this multimedia juggernaut began as the passion project of one man. In order to truly understand Pokemon, you need to understand its creator, Satoshi Tajiri. However, I know this isn't the main reason you clicked on this video, so don't worry, I'll try to speedrun it. Which shouldn't be too hard because this game is so full of bugs. Satoshi grew up in a rural area on the edge of Tokyo in the 60s and 70s. As a kid, he would run around the wilderness outside his home collecting small creatures, tadpoles, crayfish, and bugs. Although all the kids collected bugs, Tajiri was the best at it, which earned him the nickname Dr. Bug. As Tajiri got older, the area he grew up became more developed. Trees, grass, and ponds got replaced with shops and roads, and there were fewer creatures to catch. When Satoshi was in junior high, the fishing pond near his home got replaced with an arcade. Showing that he was truly decades ahead of his time, he decided to stop playing outside and spend his time playing video games instead. He was especially interested in space shooter games like Missile Command and Space Invaders, and whenever he had a break in school, he would run over to the arcade to play and run back before the break was over. Which might explain why he only got into a 2-year technical college. It was this passion for gaming that caused Dr. Bug to earn a new nickname, the Game Freak. That's the name of the company! It sure is, sir. Naturally, as a fan of games, Tajiri would seek out a source of high-quality gaming journalism. Unfortunately, Watch Mojo wouldn't be founded for another couple of decades, so he ended up having to do it himself. He began putting together Game Freak magazine, named after himself, and filled it with tips and tricks on how to beat various video games. At first, he wrote the magazine by hand, copied the pages on a photocopier, and stapled the pages together.
In a cave! With a box of scraps!
However, the magazine didn't really take off until 1983 when he put out an issue about the space shooter Xevious entitled How to Earn 10 Million Points. This issue ended up becoming incredibly popular, selling over 10,000 copies, which might not sound like that much until you realize that he's still doing all of this by hand. The demand was far more than Tajiri could handle on his own, so he ended up taking the magazine to a professional printer to make more copies. Shortly after Game Freak magazine began to spread and take off, our second main character enters the story, a young artist named Ken Sugimori. Sugimori saw the magazine in a local shop and was so impressed that he asked Tajiri if he could become the magazine's illustrator. Tajiri agreed, and Sugimori served as the magazine's illustrator for several years. When Game Freak began to make games, Sugimori made art for the games as well. He's one of only 3 people to work on Pokemon from the beginning, and his watercolor artwork that he made for Pokemon Red and Green is literally some of the most iconic video game artwork ever created. So I guess it's a good thing he decided to cold call some magazine editor he didn't know and ask for a job. Not long after this, Tajiri graduated from high school and began attending the Tokyo National University of Technology, where he majored in electronics and computer science. I wasn't able to find any evidence that he applied for Full Sail University and was rejected, so I'm forced to assume that that's true. During this time, he continued working on his magazine, but also began planning how to make the transition from writing about games to actually making them. He began by tearing apart his Famicom, the Japanese version of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and by studying the Famicom Basic Programming Language. It was during this time at technical school that Tajiri met the third person who worked on Pokemon from the beginning, Junichi Masuda. After graduating, Masuda got a job as a professional programmer, but soon heard that Tajiri was looking for someone who could make video game music. Intrigued, he gathered all of the original music that he had made and went to see Tajiri. At this point, Satoshi Tajiri had already gotten a job as a professional writer, but was still publishing Game Freak magazine out of a small apartment. Although Masuda already had a job, he began working out of the Game Freak apartment on weekends, producing original music for the company. In the same way that Ken Sugimori basically is Pokemon's art style, Junichi Masuda is the man behind Pokemon music. The soundtrack for Pokemon Red and Green alone contains some of the most iconic pieces of video game music ever composed, including and who could forget? But Masuda is more than just a composer. He also worked on Generation 1 as a programmer, and throughout the series has served as a designer, director, writer, producer, and executive saying stupid stuff in interviews to piss off fans. Shortly after Masuda joined the gang, he, Tajiri, and Sugimori began work on their first original game, Quinty, also called Mendel Palace in the United States. They originally presented the game to Nintendo, but they weren't interested in it because the designers weren't a formal game company at the time, so they ended up shopping it around to different publishers. After pitching to Namco, they were told that they were interested, but couldn't make a contract with an individual designer. That's when they made the decision to officially form Game Freak as a company. Quinty was released in 1989, as was another game that was extremely influential on the development of Pokemon, Final Fantasy Legend, known in Japan as Makai Toshi's Saga. This game was released on Game Boy, and it showed Tajiri that the system could handle more than just action games. This inspired Tajiri to make his own Game Boy game, which he thought he could do in about 6 months. After all, it's just a little black and white game on a handheld device. There's no way it's gonna take 12 times that long, right? Now's the part of the video where we can finally start talking about Pokemon's development. Now, I know that wasn't a great speedrun time, but I blame RNG. While Final Fantasy Legend inspired Tajiri to make the game, the actual concept of what the game should be came from a number of different places. The first piece of the puzzle was the link cable, a piece of hardware that was released with the Game Boy and allowed you to connect two different consoles together. While I always thought the link cable was so you could create a set of Game Boy nunchucks, at the time it was mostly used for connecting together games like Tetris so that two players could compete against each other. Tajiri, however, saw the potential for the cable to trade items between two games instead of just competing. In an interview in a Japanese book called Pokédex, Tajiri explained why he wanted to make a game about trading. In Dragon Quest, there's a rare item called the Madcap, and Sugimori was talking about how he had 2 of them. I'd spent so many days trying to get a Madcap of my own, but I just couldn't get one. So I thought, well, since he has 2, why can't he give me one? So our original idea for Pokemon wasn't, we want to make an RPG, instead it was, we want to trade. I, for one, find this concept totally fascinating. Before they even decided what genre the game was going to be, they knew they wanted to make a game about finding and collecting rare things and trading them with your friends. The idea to trade creatures back and forth came afterwards and had 2 main inspirations. The first was the time Tajiri spent as Dr. Bug, finding and collecting bugs, tadpoles, and other small critters as a child. The other inspiration was giant monster media of the time, including kaiju movies like Godzilla and tokusatsu series like Ultraman. One particularly influential series was Ultra 7, an Ultraman spin-off in which the main character stores monsters in capsules, also called monster balls,
phrasing,
and releases them to help fight other more dangerous monsters. Not only is there a clear parallel in storing Pokemon in Pokeballs, but some of the earliest designed Pokemon, such as Rhydon, Nidoking, and even Blastoise, have clear influence from kaiju designs. Even the game's original name, Capsule Monsters, was inspired by Ultra 7. These 3 influences, the link cable, bug catching, and kaiju media, were the guiding forces behind the earliest versions of Capsule Monsters. Sometime in 1990, Game Freak put together a presentation to pitch their idea for Capumon to Nintendo. The amazing folks over at Helix Chamber have been able to recover and reconstruct this early Capumon pitch document, and it's a treasure trove of information on the earliest stages of Pokemon's development. In this early document, the game is described as being similar to Gashapon, a kind of fancy Japanese vending machine that sells figurines. These days, the genre of gacha games inspired by Gashapon is basically everywhere. There's a good chance you saw an ad for one at the beginning of this video, and I'm pretty sure I can't actually call myself a YouTuber until I've been offered a sponsorship by Brain Meadow Pigeons. However, at the time the concept was pretty novel. The document also reveals that players would befriend and capture Pokemon by increasing their charisma stat, rather than by wearing them down in battle. This shows that the player character was originally intended to have their own stats that leveled up over time, in addition to the stats of the Pokemon themselves. In fact, early on the player character actually took an active role in the battles, but this was changed later on to keep the focus on the Pokemon. In addition, it seems that the enemy characters, and possibly even the player, were intended to whip their Pokemon. Whips can be seen in the early concept art for Capumon, and even in the final game there are several NPCs whose sprites contain whips, such as Team Rocket Grunts and even Sabrina. Using your charisma stat wasn't the only way for you to collect Capumon either. Money would have played a much more significant role in this version of Capumon. Each Capumon would have had a price assigned to them, which you would use to pay for them at shops. Even when you were trading Pokemon with your friends, whoever traded the lower value Pokemon would have to pay the difference to the other person. Depending on who you asked, this feature either got scrapped because it just felt wrong to pay money for a living creature, or because it took up too much memory space to assign a monetary value to each Pokemon. Given how the rest of the game's development goes, I'm inclined to believe the latter. However, there are still some remnants of this in the final game. You can buy a Magikarp from a salesman, and in the game corner you can exchange coins that you win from the slot machines to buy Pokemon. Aside from these differences, the game actually resembles the final product. The map is pretty similar, and the concept art for the Pokemon stats isn't too different from the final game. This document also includes early concept art for 31 different Pokemon, most of which ended up making it to the final product. Some were dropped, and others were pretty heavily redesigned. Gyarados, for example, wasn't always a sea serpent, and used to resemble a giant sandworm from Dune. However, for the most part, the Pokemon that did exist are pretty similar to their final forms. Which makes it even more shocking that this original pitch was actually rejected by Nintendo. As far as I was able to find, this is for two main reasons. The first was the name. They were worried that they wouldn't be able to trademark Capsule Monsters. However, this issue was easily fixed by changing the name to Pocket Monsters, or Pokemon for short. The second issue seemed to be that they simply had trouble understanding the concept and found it too confusing. Reportedly, Game Freak actually pitched and was rejected by Nintendo multiple times, and this may have spelled the end for Pokemon if it wasn't for one man, Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto is kind of a big deal. At this point, he had already helped design Donkey Kong, Super Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda, so his opinion definitely held some weight at Nintendo. Tajiri was introduced to Miyamoto through a mutual friend, Tsunekazu Ishihara, the current president of the Pokemon Company. It turns out, Miyamoto was actually already a fan of Tajiri's previous game, Quinty. After meeting Tajiri, Miyamoto reportedly became something of a mentor to him. And he took an interest in Capumon even though it was rejected by Nintendo because he thought that the concept of using the link cables to trade between two different consoles was a unique experience that could only be found on the Game Boy. He eventually took it upon himself to pitch the idea to Nintendo himself, and the idea was finally approved. The initial release date was set for December 1991, about 4.5 years before the games would actually be released. Although the game was now approved, Game Freak soon ran into another issue: money. Quinty had only been a modest success, and they wouldn't have enough money to finish development through to the end. Enter Gunpei Yokoi, the creator of the Game Boy. Yokoi was introduced to Tajiri through Miyamoto, and when they didn't have enough money to continue work on Pokemon, he assigned them to work on existing Nintendo properties. The first game he assigned to them was Yoshi, which ended up becoming a Tetris-like puzzle game for the NES. The game ended up being unexpectedly popular, selling 500,000 copies on its first day and giving Game Freak a much-needed financial boost. However, even a successful game like Yoshi wasn't enough to finance the entire development all by itself. Game Freak ended up releasing 6 games in total in the time it took them to develop Red and Green. These games helped keep the company afloat, but resulted in Pokemon having to be delayed several times. In addition, although these games sold well enough to keep Game Freak from going out of business, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing for them. In fact, the entire development process was full of financial difficulties. There were times when Tajiri wasn't able to pay himself and had to rely on his father for financial support, and the lack of funding resulted in a lot of difficulties within the company. According to an interview with Time magazine, 5 employees once quit at the same time when they found out how dire the financial situation was. The Satoshi Tajiri manga also includes an incident in which all 3 programmers quit at the same time. I wasn't able to determine whether these 2 sources are referring to the same event or 2 different instances, but even a single mass employee walkout would be really difficult for a small company, and especially if they lose all their programmers at the same time. Luckily, Junichi Masuda had some experience as a professional programmer and was able to pick up some of the slack, in addition to creating the music for the game. However, the transition wasn't perfectly smooth. At some point, while trying to figure out the existing code, Masuda ended up causing the Unix workstation containing all of the game's data to crash. No one at the company was familiar with Unix, and if they weren't able to recover the data, it probably would have been the end for Pokemon, since they wouldn't have had the financial resources to start over from scratch. This is why you always back up your important data. Luckily, they were able to recover the data, and development on the game was able to continue. However, losing all of their programmers in the middle of development might be one of the reasons why Generation 1 is so full of bugs. And I don't just mean Caterpie. From this point on, the timing of things starts to get a bit fuzzy. Based on the information I have, it's easy to piece together many of the events that happened during Generation 1's long development, but it's hard to say exactly when these different events happened. Because of this, we're going to be taking a bit of a detour and using something called the internal list as a rough timeline for how the games were developed. So what is the internal list? Basically, it's the order that the Pokemon are listed inside the memory of the Game Boy cartridges. The internal list order has a lot of oddities. Pokemon that are related by evolution aren't always listed next to each other and are sometimes separated by dozens of spaces. And there are even gaps where Pokemon that used to exist in the game were removed. There's enough room in the internal list for 190 Pokemon, but only 151 made it to the final game. These gaps in the memory are actually responsible for the famous missing no glitch, which happens when the game tries to load a Pokemon from one of these empty spaces. So why do we even care about this internal list order? Well, there's strong evidence that the order of the internal list closely matches the order that the different Pokemon were designed and programmed into the game. For example, Rhydon, often claimed to be the first Pokemon ever designed, fills the number 1 spot in this internal list. And other Pokemon that we know were designed early, either due to interviews or concept art, such as Clefairy, Gengar, Lapras, and Nidoran, all appear early on in this list. Knowing the order that the Pokemon were designed in not only opens a window into how the creature design shifted over the game's development, but into the mechanics as well. For this next session, I'm going to be moving chronologically through the internal list and taking detours as interesting developments come up. As mentioned before, many of the early Pokemon were inspired by kaiju movies, and the early sections of the internal list are chock full of kaiju-inspired Pokemon. This early section also contains a number of Pokemon that were designed to fill a specific practical purpose in the world. For example, Rhydon was designed as something of a workhorse, Lapras ferries people across water, and Clefairy was simply designed to be a cute pet. Thanks to Pokemon researchers like Dr. Lava in the Helix Chamber, we also know many of the Pokemon that fill the empty gaps left over in this internal list. For example, in this early period, some of the missing Pokemon include Gaoon and Omega, 2 Pokemon that closely resemble Godzilla and Mechagodzilla respectively. The last unique thing about this earliest period in Pokemon design is that all of the designs would have come from Tajiri and Sugimori themselves because the company was still young and they had yet to hire the other designers. This gives the group a more uniform look without the wide range of designs that we've come to expect from Pokemon. Based on documents, such as the Capumon pitch document, we have a pretty good idea of which Pokemon were designed early, and we also know that Pokemon had to be put on hiatus to develop games like Yoshi. The second section of the internal list includes Pokemon that were designed after this hiatus, and there's a clear shift in the design philosophy. Specifically, the new Pokemon have something that the earliest designs were lacking: types. While types may seem like an intrinsic part of Pokemon, the earliest designs actually weren't designed with types in mind because they didn't exist yet. However, the developers realized that they needed an additional system to distinguish the Pokemon from each other. Otherwise, they'd just be weak or strong, which would lead to a pretty shallow battle system. The addition of types allows for much more variety in the gameplay, inspired a wider range of Pokemon designs, and ensures that even strong Pokemon have weaknesses that can be exploited, unless they're Psychic type. This second era of Pokemon designs includes several Pokemon that were clearly designed to be embodiments of their elements, such as Graveler, Magmar, and Electabuzz. Even Arbok could have been envisioned as an embodiment of poison during this stage. This section of the internal list also includes the 3 legendary birds, which Helix Chamber has theorized were the first Pokemon that were designed to be dual-typed. This seems like a pretty reasonable theory. These Pokemon were clearly designed to be both bird type, which later got replaced and merged in with the flying type, and also one of the elemental types of ice, fire, or thunder. This makes them distinct from the Pokemon that came before them. Although some of those Pokemon later became dual-typed, many of them would make sense as a single type. It's even possible that the birds were originally supposed to be the only dual-typed Pokemon, and that having 2 types was part of their legendaryness. This era of designs was also the first to include 2 new members of the team, Shigeki Morimoto and Motofumi Fujiwara, which added a greater variety of designs to the Pokemon. The third era of Pokemon designs probably began around late 1993 to early 1994, following a hiatus in which Game Freak released the games Mario & Wario, Nantan to Isho, Kuru Puzzle, and Pulseman. This era has 2 main distinguishing features: a further exploration of the evolution mechanic, and the addition of Atsuko Nishida to the team. By looking at the Pokemon designed up to this point, the only ones that have a clear evolutionary relationship are the Nidoran lines, with male and female Nidoran evolving into Nidoking and Nidoqueen respectively. While there are some Pokemon that ended up being related, such as Ghastly and Gengar or Graveler and Golem, these Pokemon are separated from each other in the internal list, and their designs are distinct enough that it's likely the decision to make them evolutionary relatives was made later. It's possible that evolution was intended to be a special gimmick for the Nidoran lines, and that all the other creatures were originally designed to be standalone. This all changed during Stage 3, when for the first time in the internal list you begin to see evolutionary families that are right next to each other and clearly designed to all be part of the same family. Towards the beginning of this era, we mostly see self-contained lines, such as the Vulpix and Pikachu lines, and towards the end we see Pokemon that were added as additional evolutions or pre-evolutions of Pokemon from previous stages, including Machop and Ekans. This stage also experiments with how Pokemon can evolve, by introducing Pokemon that evolve with evolutionary stones like Jigglypuff, and branched evolutions like Eevee and the Evolutions. The addition of a female designer, Atsuko Nishida, also had a big influence on the designs of this era. Up until this point, all of the Pokemon had been designed by male designers, and they had an emphasis on tough-looking Pokemon. As part of the focus on trading and collecting, the designers came up with a wide range of designs. Weird Pokemon with multiple bodies, mechanical Pokemon, etc., but they didn't have many cute designs. That's when they decided to bring in Nishida to design more cute monsters. It's hard to overstate the importance of adding Nishida to the team. For one thing, she's gone on to become one of the most prolific Pokemon designers of all time, designing more Pokemon than anybody other than Ken Sugimori himself. She's also designed some of the most iconic Pokemon of all time, including most of the evolutions, although not Eevee themselves, and the most famous Pokemon of all, Pikachu. She also designed a number of other incredibly important Pokemon, which we'll get to in a bit, but for now, let's take a brief detour to discuss how the mascot of the series, and not just one of the most iconic Pokemon, but one of the most iconic characters of all time, came to be. According to Nishida, she was given very few guidelines when designing Pikachu. She wasn't told to make it cute or a mouse Pokemon. In fact, she doesn't even really consider it to be a mouse. The only instruction she was originally given when designing Pikachu was that it should be an electric type that evolves twice, and the final evolution should look strong. And based on these criteria, I think we can safely call the design a complete failure. After all, Pikachu does only evolve once, and while I love Raichu, it's not exactly the toughest looking Pokemon. However, it turns out that during development, Pikachu actually had a second evolution, named Gorochu. Gorochu is described as having fangs, horns, and looking like a god of thunder. We actually know what Gorochu's back sprite looked like, and artist Rachel Briggs came up with this concept for what it may have looked like originally. So why didn't Gorochu make it to the final game? In short, it's because of storage issues. We'll talk more about this later, but Pokemon ran into several issues with storage throughout its development process. One of the ways they got around this was by reducing the number of 3-stage evolution lines and having more Pokemon that only evolved once. We can still see the effects of this on the internal list. Gorochu's spot remains empty, and there are several other slots where evolutions, pre-evolutions, or even middle stages were removed from the final game. Part of the reason Pikachu looks so cute may have been because Gorochu was supposed to look strong. Nishida had a philosophy with her designs that she wanted the pre-evolutions to look different from the final forms so that it's a surprise when they evolve. She may have wanted Pikachu to look cute so that it's a surprise when it turns into a horned god of thunder. To make Pikachu as cute as possible, Nishida actually worked with Koji Nishino, who was the inspiration for Snorlax. Nishino became an unofficial cuteness supervisor and gave Nishida tips on how she could make Pikachu even cuter. Although she had to work hard to earn his approval, once she did, he loved the final design so much that he wanted to keep it all to himself. That's why Pikachu has such a low encounter rate in Viridian Forest. Nishino wanted to make it hard for people to get one so that he would be the only one who had one. Unfortunately for Nishino, but very fortunately for Pokemon as a whole, the plan completely backfired. Among players, Pikachu was treated as the first rare Pokemon in the game, and people started telling each other and writing articles about how to get one, which ended up making Pikachu even more popular. I mentioned earlier that some 3-stage evolutions had to be cut down due to storage limitations, but lack of memory on the Game Boy cartridges was actually a recurring problem throughout Pokemon's development. Limiting the number of letters that can be used to name Pokemon and the player, as well as limiting the number of moves that each Pokemon can learn to 4, were some of the ways that they tried to limit the memory usage. Surprisingly, one of the biggest features that led to memory issues was being able to nickname the Pokemon you can catch. At several different points in the development, Game Freak had to choose between allowing you to nickname the Pokemon or some other feature, and every single time they chose nicknames. That's why you can only have a single save file on the cartridge. They had to choose between having multiple files or nicknames, and they chose nicknames. At one point, towards the end of development, they even had to choose between cutting down the number of Pokemon to 30 or nicknames, and they still chose nicknames! Luckily, Shigeru Miyamoto was able to step in and give them access to Game Boy cartridges with more memory, which allowed them to store all 151 Pokemon and nickname them too. Alright, let's get back to the internal list. Stage 4 mostly consisted of adding additional members to old evolution families, such as Haunter to bridge the gap between Ghastly and Gengar, and Magikarp to evolve into Gyarados. This is probably also around the time that Gyarados got redesigned into its current form. A few interesting things to note from this era. We can see some Pokemon being added specifically for plot reasons, such as Snorlax or Mewtwo, and we can also disprove the long-standing theory that Venomoth and Butterfree were switched. I've always thought this theory made a lot of sense, but since Caterpie, Metapod, and Butterfree are all right next to each other in the internal list, it's pretty clear they were meant to be a single family. Towards the end of the internal list, we finally get the starter Pokemon, Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, which were all designed by Atsuko Nishida. While she didn't design all of the starter evolutions, she did design Charizard, which makes her the designer of probably the two most iconic Pokemon of all time. Speaking of the starter Pokemon, their development is actually pretty interesting. In the internal list, the members of the Squirtle and Charizard families aren't grouped together, but actually alternate. The order is Charmander, Squirtle, Charmeleon, Wartortle, and Charizard. After Charizard is a missing no spot where you would expect Blastoise to be, but Blastoise was actually designed much earlier. This empty spot actually contained a different Pokemon, which was Wartortle's original evolution. Blastoise, similarly, may have had a different pre-evolution, although Helix Chamber only recovered the back sprite, so that's speculative. In either case, it seems that at some point towards the end of development, it was decided that having two different families of water turtles was redundant, and Blastoise was combined to make the Squirtle family that we know today. It's also just surprising that these Pokemon are so late in the internal list, because that implies that the decision to let players choose between 3 different Pokemon at the beginning of the game was made pretty late in development. I wonder how players got their first Pokemon before that. The very last Pokemon in the internal list are the Bellsprout and Oddish lines, 2 version-exclusive lines of Grass and Poison-type Pokemon. This is the only place in the internal list where we see Pokemon that are clearly designed to be version exclusives, and they may have just been added to make the 2 different versions of the game more different from each other. Interestingly, Pokemon wasn't originally designed to be 2 different versions. Instead, Tajiri wanted each cartridge to have a unique ID number that would determine which Pokemon could be found on that cartridge. He wanted each cartridge to feel unique, and also wanted to encourage trading by limiting which Pokemon each player could get in their game. However, this was not only a difficult programming challenge, but it's also transparent to the player. Players might not even realize that certain Pokemon are missing from their games. Saving the day once again, it's actually Shigeru Miyamoto who came up with the idea of having 2 different versions with differently colored cartridges. This would make the differences immediately clear and would encourage players to trade Pokemon between the 2 different versions. Having different versions of the game wasn't the only decision designed to encourage players to trade more. From the very beginning, trading was the core concept at the center of the game, and this concept affected every area of the development. This is partly responsible for the wide variety of different types of Pokemon designs. Different players will like different types of Pokemon and might be willing to trade for them. They also made certain Pokemon that can only evolve by trading, and made it so that Pokemon that have been traded gain more experience, so that trading Pokemon can actually give you a competitive boost. We are nearing the end of Pokemon's development, but there's still one major system that we haven't touched on yet: the battle system. While it's clear from the earliest prototype artwork that Red and Green was intended to have an RPG battle system, the specifics changed a lot over the development. As we mentioned earlier, originally the trainers themselves were going to be involved in the battles, possibly with whips.
Whip it! Whip it good!
Early on in development, there was also a sort of anti-system where the loser of a battle would have to give a Pokemon to the winner, but this was also scrapped because players didn't like giving away the Pokemon they had spent so much time training. So now the loser just gives money to the winner instead. The most shocking thing about the battle system, however, is that it almost had to be scrapped entirely. According to Shigeki Morimoto, although battle systems were planned from the earliest stages, as you can see them in the early concept art, they were actually implemented pretty late in the process. Morimoto actually ended up being the lead programmer behind the battle system, but admitted in interviews that he didn't find it very interesting and thought it would be a pain in the butt to program. Game Freak nearly ran out of time to implement the battle system, but Nintendo insisted that they wanted battles in the game, so Game Freak had to make it work. At first, the battles were just something that the players would watch on the screen without interacting. You would see the battle play out and then find out who won or lost. However, when they presented this version of the battle system to Nintendo, they were told that it was too boring. They made the battles interactive, but even the interactive battles were pretty different at first. The designers wanted to avoid having too many numbers in battle, so at first they actually ended up using text instead of health bars. When you took damage, you would get a message like, "Nidoran poked you with a Torn," it didn't seem to hurt much. Game Freak was eventually able to get the battle system implemented and working with the link cable, but from what I can tell they cut it pretty close, and it would be generous to call the system in the final games finished. Now with all the major features implemented, we're nearing the end of the game's development, and although they've been delayed by nearly 4 years, they're finally ready for a release in October of 1995. Tajiri sends the prototype version to Tsunekazu Ishihara and breathes a sigh of relief that his work is finally done. That is, until he gets a phone call from Ishihara a few days later, basically telling him the game has no soul, the plot is confusing, and he should completely rewrite it. Tajiri spent 6 months frantically rewriting the story of the game, and by the time he was done, the games were finally ready to be released to the world, or more specifically Japan, in February of 1996. Pokemon's initial sales figures were less than great. For one thing, nobody was really interested in the Game Boy anymore. It was a 7-year-old console and sales were way down, to the point that even strangers were telling Tajiri that he had missed the boat. Not only that, but the release window was far from optimal. Because of the last-minute story rewrite, they ended up missing the holiday season for 1995, and initial orders from retailers were a lot lower than they originally thought. Far from being a smash hit, their weekly sales figures barely kept them in the top 10. Even after everything they had gone through up to this point, they would still need one more miracle for the games to really break through. And that miracle was Mew. Mew, the mysterious 151st Pokemon, was briefly mentioned in the game, but wasn't actually supposed to appear in it. However, after debugging the game, which reportedly took longer than any other Nintendo game up to that point, the debugging tools were removed, which left a little bit of extra space on the cartridge. The developers were told not to touch a single byte, but Shigeki Morimoto realized that there was just enough room to add one more Pokemon. At first, basically nobody knew that Mew was on the cartridges, and it was thought to be impossible to actually acquire one in-game. Luckily, Pokemon Red and Green were an absolute glitchy mess, and through random chance some players were able to accidentally trigger an encounter with Mew. As months passed, Mew became something of an urban legend, and rumors of how to catch one ended up spreading like wildfire. Game Freak realized that they couldn't ignore these rumors forever, and Mew was officially revealed to the world in the May 1996 issue of CoroCoro Comics. Not only did this magazine reveal the existence of Mew, but it also included a giveaway in which 20 lucky players would be able to add a Mew to their Game Boy cartridges. This giveaway ended up being a huge success, with over 78,000 people entering, and ended up giving Pokemon the momentum it needed to really take off. Before long, they were selling as many copies in a week as they used to sell in a month, and that number kept growing to be 3, then 4 times larger. By the time they reached number 1 in weekly sales, the games had already been out for a year and a half. At this point, Pokemon was already a huge success in Japan, and there was only one hurdle left: the international market. We now know that Pokemon would end up becoming hugely popular all around the world, but at the time this was far from guaranteed. Although Game Freak had some international success with games like Mario and Wario, they were worried that a game with so much text would be a hard sell for the American audiences. This fear was not unfounded. Even some games like Dragon Quest, which were incredibly popular in Japan, had difficulty breaking into the American market. Furthermore, there were technical issues with porting the games into another language like English. Japanese words, such as names, typically require a lot fewer characters than English words, and the programming had to be updated to handle these longer words. The final problem was with the Pokemon designs themselves. There was a theory that cute designs didn't do well in the American market, and Nintendo of America wanted to completely redesign the Pokemon and the art style. The only examples I was able to find was this artwork for the redesigned Charmander family. But according to interviews, they tried to redesign Pikachu to look like a tiger with huge breasts, or basically a sexy cosplay version of Pikachu. Luckily for us, Game Freak rejected these redesigns, although not for the reasons you might think. Ishihara actually said in an interview that he thought that the redesigns were interesting and he appreciated the cultural differences, but figured that if the games were going to fail anyways due to the text issue, they might as well keep the graphics the same. Whatever the reason, however, I think we can all agree that they made the right decision. I don't think a busty tigress would have gotten their own Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade floats, for one thing. Of course, when Pokemon finally did launch in America in September of 1998, more than 2.5 years after launching in Japan, they were an instant smash hit. Since then, the franchise has gone on to have incredible success in anime, trading card games, augmented reality, and even Hollywood film, and none of it would have been possible if it wasn't for this small group of people giving everything they had and overcoming countless obstacles over 6 years to make it happen. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you so much for watching that video. If you made it this far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this in the future. If you like this video, make sure to check out the rest of my channel. I have a bunch of videos on Pokemon design topics and other game design topics as well. And join me next time for a look at how to break a trading card game. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.